Hello, my name is Jacob Hessler, and I'm going to be doing my informative speech over teenagers and their reading habits and how it affects them. Something that concerns parents and teachers today are teenagers and their reading habits. You rarely see a kid sitting down in a park reading a book, going to their friend's house to talk about the latest release by their favorite author. However, teens might be reading in more untraditional ways. And if they are, do they get the same challenge of literacy and critical thinking they might get from a book? However, as I grew, first I should tell a little bit about myself. I've worked at a library since I was 16. Reading throughout my childhood and young adult life has never been a hassle or a war for me to pick up a book. However, as I grew up, I only noticed that certain people read. It was something for me to think on. Are people who read smarter than those who don't? And if they are smarter, why don't more people read? It was something that bothered me, so getting the chance to really research some information to be able to relay it to you is something I was happy to do. When I started researching, I thought maybe I should start off finding information about younger readers from an elementary school age and how they think of reading. Because everyone says when you're young, your brain is like a sponge, so thinking that way, I found a certain information on how teachers incorporated reading into the classroom, and if it was really stuck with them. Reading for Pleasure, a research overview, it really covered three main points, well, as it gave an in-depth guide over reading habits and how they progress with age. And at what point should people really be advocating reading? It showed that kids at a tender age really only think of reading as a classroom assignment because reading is only associated with their classroom. It shows that when the parents are also involved in getting their children to read, it is a valid form, in showing them it is a valid form of entertainment, kids pick it up. Really, this means that to get a child at a young age involves both a teacher and a parent. If a child isn't really involved in reading when they grow older into their teens, they start treating reading as a forbidden thing to do that only certain people do. In young people's attitudes towards reading, an article that the author wrote gives great data from students on how they should start treat reading and how they are treating reading now. Most girls think of reading as a relaxing thing, whereas some teenage boys just flat out said they don't like it. However, that doesn't mean they don't read at all. This could mean that they just might be getting their form of reading elsewhere. However, when reported with what boys read in writing technology and teens, that even when a teen reports high level of reading activity online, they don't count it or take it serious. This could stem from teachers and parents who think only reading a book counts as intelligent reading that helps them, thought-provoking. So this is my assignment. To inform you guys of teens' reading habits and how it affects them in different ways. First, allow me to go back and pick up from a child's standpoint. Earlier that I said when a teacher and a parent is involved in reading, it makes it easier for the child to transition into reading as an entertaining thing. Now, before I even want to go on, I want to clarify what reading does for a person. In Journal of Direct Instruction, there's an article that says it makes you smarter, it builds your vocabulary, your literacy and verbal intelligence, and even your comprehension skills. Reading isn't something that you're able to avoid apart from reading. All we need is to be able to read is our eyes. It is essential to our everyday life and is one of the most important ways of communicating. So reading being an important part of today's society and all makes us teach reading and understanding to today's youth in hopes that when they grow, they will be able to comprehend everything that comes their way in the future. When children begin reading, a ton of things go through their head. In the Journal of Direct Instruction, kids begin to form pictures in their head as they read more and more, and their minds begin to make pictures without them even having to tell their brain to. Your sensory cortex lights up while motion activates the motor cortex. And while you may think that this is limited only to reading, experts insist that our brains are exposed to narratives all day long. Starting a child off right with reading, no matter how you do it, seems like the right thing to do. Right, so now we have that information that making sure our kids read will be able to help them develop their brains and help them later on in life. So when teachers aren't reading to the kids in their face anymore and they start assigning reading assignments to teenagers as they grow older, all they can think of is now another assignment. Committed and reluctant male teenage readers, Beyond Bedtime Stories, addresses only males, but they brought up a good point. Unless they were brought up in a household which pushed reading, males are the first to think that reading is something exhausting or boring to do. Really, at an early age, they develop this characteristic and it follows them throughout their entire life. Girls are different. In the young people's attitudes toward reading, girls are more than likely to read and find it enjoyable than a guy would. The words girls associate with reading are relaxing, exciting, fun, which leads me to my next point. It's teen boys and girls and how they're a big influence on each other and how they're more influence on each other than their parents when they get older and in their teenage years in the middle and high school. In the Young People's Attitudes Toward Reading article states that when teenagers have close friends who tell them to read or advise them to get a book and they like it, they're more than likely going to try it out. So reading books and literature wouldn't be a big problem if there wasn't such a stigma built on it in high school and middle school. Now, I'm not saying that the stigma on reading is making it go extinct, of course not. But more and more teens of today aren't reading. Associated Press, 1 in 4 read no books last year. It's an article. In 2008, 1 in 4 kids didn't read one book. And that was reported in 2008. And they also reported that the numbers were actually going up. So more and more kids aren't reading. They aren't developing their vocabulary and comprehension skills out of class, which could lead them to having struggles in college. However, just because kids aren't reading books and literature doesn't mean they aren't reading. Teens today are much more tech savvy and advanced, traveling through the internet, through social media, blogs, articles. These are all forms of valid reading, considering the average Facebook post isn't on par with something good, like good literature, like probably The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, but it's still reading. One study, fairly recent, in Writing Technology and Teens, reported that teens who actually are doing a high level of literacy online aren't thinking it as being true reading. Even though it is reported that these high levels of reading were on par with light novels, the teens didn't consider it true reading. I stated this earlier and made me think of the stigma on reading. It isn't just a kid thing. It's also for adults. Adults and teachers are quick to dismiss ways of learning if it isn't the traditional way. But that doesn't mean they're always right. An article called Teenagers reported in 2010 saying the average teen spends 31 hours online. Seeing how teenagers are always chatting or talking with their friends or surfing the web or doing homework or for entertainment most of the time means that there's an extensive amount of reading going on with it too. However, the problem is with this, it doesn't provoke critical thinking in a person. The fact that teens aren't just reading through different medias, from ebooks to posts online, can't help but to admit the fact that even though teens aren't reading the same way everyone else do in past generations, doesn't mean that they aren't reading. But it does put a light on critical thinking and expanding their vocabulary. Even though those things can be achieved through modern conveniences like the internet, and even though we covered the fact that teens weren't reading traditionally, an article published in 2012 called Younger Americans Reading and Library Habits proved that younger people, when doing schoolwork and just leisure reading, are neck to neck with the strongest readers, which are 30 to 40-year-olds. In fact, teenagers are one of the library's biggest supporters and actually go to the library more than an adult. This leads me to my last and final point. Just because teenagers aren't reading the same way past generations, doesn't that mean they aren't taking on the skills gained from reading elsewhere? Teenagers are finding different ways of gaining critical thinking and developing their vocabulary. It might seem lazy to go out and just Google an answer but in this day and age, is it really that weird to do that? So, that was my speech. Thank you very much.